Hello and welcome everyone. Week 5 to climatology. We are talking about the carbon cycle this week. So building off a little bit of our kind of the theory behind all the climate science and the fundamental physical and physics-based research that has kind of led us to understanding, the role of greenhouse gases. Obviously, carbon plays an awfully big role in this, and but carbon is part of this natural cycle that occurs as well. And so this is what this week is devoted to. First off, fun fact for the day. Fun depending on who you ask and how you think about it. But so this was just produced by the ACAP, the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy at the University of Alaska, and so it's been updated just recently, right? So it goes all the way through 2020, and it's pretty shocking to see just how much has already occurred. And this is something that I really like to highlight in a lot of my classes because I think folks get fixated on sort of what the media says about climate change and oh, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, and then the reality, Alaska's already experienced a lot of this. So this is both like depressing, but also like really useful for us as we think about climate adaptation and our adaptation plans. Because if the North Slope of Alaska, this part, has already seen an 11-degree Fahrenheit increase on average, um, I mean that tells us a lot, right? I mean the world has not come to an end up there. For some villages it has because they've had to move, and because of increasing storms and erosion. But for the most part, people have been able to adapt, and they've seen worse. They'll be the first ones to tell you that they've, well, not seen worse, but they've lived through a lot. And so, but most of the state, certainly Western Alaska, Northern Alaska, and most of the interior of Alaska has experienced just like these really major average increases just in the last 50 years. It's pretty impressive. And even places that like folks go to all the time, like down here on the east side of this Kenai Peninsula, where Seward is in the Kenai Fjords National Park, they've even seen a significant 5-degree increase, which is pretty major, uh, yeah, pretty significant. So yeah, both good and but also concerning for sure. All right, so carbon cycle. Remember, we're talking about all the cycles and systems that we understand, interact, and control our climate. If you look at this, you see all these couplings and this ocean hydrosphere and these clouds and atmosphere biosphere interaction. You only see carbon sort of in the aerosols, but as you've read in the chapter, carbon is basically through all of these cycles. It's a key component of all of those interactions. So here's the really nice diagram from the book, right? That just kind of gets into the relative pots of carbon available and how they interact. So um, as you might imagine, it's pretty darn complex, and this is a really simple representation of it. But it basically, the carbon cycle includes every plant, animal, microbe, every piece of photosynthesizing leaf and fallen tree, every ocean, lake, pond, and puddle, and every bit of soil, sediment, carbonate rock. All of it, including even volcanic eruptions, right, are all part of the carbon cycle. So, and carbon exchanges pretty rapidly. There's three main reservoirs, as the book kind of mentioned, right? You've got the ocean, which is the biggest, the atmosphere, and the land. And I just want to real quickly kind of point out something about the units. So it's here is this PG of carbon per year, and hopefully you've picked up on the year to the -1 just means per year, right? So you can imagine as PG carbon over a year. So that's the amount of carbon per year, and the PG stands for petagram, not pentagram, but petagram of carbon, and that's and another way to think of it is really gigaton, which is just a humongous number, right? It's 10 to the 15 grams, or basically 1 billion tons, and this is the metric tons, which is 1,000 kilograms. So it's just a ginormous amount of carbon, and actual mass, right, involved in this carbon cycle. So when you see these, think either petagrams or gigatons of carbon per year. So average increase of 4 gigatons of carbon per year. You see here that the atmosphere is 589. That's the stasis version of carbon in the atmosphere. That's how much would exist in the absence of sort of human modification right now. And this is our contribution, and then plus or minus 10, because there's a lot of uncertainty about who produces what when, not because of what we measure, but because of what gets reported. But anyway, so you see all these numbers associated. So think of these as all as gigatons. I mean, just these massive amounts, gigatons of stuff going up and coming back down and being trapped in forest and soil and inside the ocean. So let's do the ocean first, since it's the biggest, right? The largest absolutely is the ocean. It contains approximately 40,000 gigatons of carbon. Most of this is dissolved inorganic carbon, which is the deep stuff that's sort of been mineralized through, bacteria and that kind of thing. So most of that is stored way down deep. Only about 1,000 gigatons is on the surface and sort of actively being utilized. So we've got 38, 39 gigatons down here, all stored as inorganic carbon, and then we got about 1,000 up here. And this is the stuff that's really being actively moved around, right? It's either coming down through atmospheric deposition or through photosynthesis in phytoplankton, right? And it's going back up through respiration, both plankton and zooplankton kind of respiration, as well as bacterial respiration, all kinds of things. And anytime we take food out of it, we are actually taking the carbon out, and then it's liberated, right? And so the 1,000 is kind of up here. 1,000 gigatons ish is sitting here in the surface, being moved around. So the dissolved inorganic carbon is stored down here largely because of the biological pump, right? So hopefully those who have taken oceanography can talk about this a little bit in class when we meet, because it's a fascinating thing, right? So phytoplankton take up the carbon due to photosynthesis up here in the top. They are eaten by zooplankton, and then organic matter has kind of gone through the food web, right, up to some apex kind of predator, high level trophic level. And then when they die, it sinks. Either they get eaten by something else or they just simply die, right? And then it sinks and it becomes mineralized by bacteria, and that's on the order of 40 or 50 gigatons of carbon per year. So 40,000 gigatons. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to come up with where that might have come from, right? There's a lot of biomass in the ocean. It's the most biologically diverse place on Earth, and so yeah, having that decomposition, or that basically dead organic matter that gets remineralized and therefore deorganic, organified, that's not really a word, but you know what I mean. And it kind of gets trapped in the deep darks of the ocean. So you can imagine that there's just with even with 1,000, and the fact that things are always moving carbon around, and you're always photosynthesizing, you're always getting eaten, you're always dying. This is a pretty tightly coupled relationship, a strong and rapid coupling of atmospheric CO2 and the ocean, right? The more that's up here, the more the potential for moving carbon around in the ocean. And this is really key, right? It's different than land. So let's talk a little bit about that. How does it get down there? Because you have both the dying animals, but then you also have just this downwelling. So there's a physical carbon pump, not a biological carbon pump. And this occurs, so you get the downwelling where there's cold, dense water. These are called carbon sinks, because the downwelling currents basically bring dissolved CO2 down to the depths of the ocean. And once it's there, it just slowly moves, for in really deep ocean currents that don't move very fast, and that carbon stays there for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. But eventually they do come up. Those deep currents intersect with, more rapidly moving currents, and eventually that does come up to the surface, and that's the upwelling. And this is tightly coupled with temperature, and so you get the upwelling when you get like coastlines, and it physically brings it up in the water column, which gives more energy, gives more warmth. And as soon as you get that cold water up to the surface, it releases that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So couple that with the biological side, the biological pump and the physical carbon pump. You can just imagine there's a lot going on in the ocean that's really, really tightly coupled to the atmospheric CO2 levels. This is key. What's also key is that this isn't totally uniform. So I mentioned the word sink, and sources versus sinks is really important in ecology. It's also really important in climatology. Hopefully you've heard it in the ecological context, but it's the very same. You have sinks in climatology, and especially when we're talking about carbon, where carbon is stored, right? We can think of trees as carbon sinks because it's stored in the tree, versus sources, which is those things that are actually releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And that's like, things dying, or a ton of respiration, or that kind of stuff. And so what's really interesting is to start to look at then the spatial pattern of carbon sources versus sinks in the ocean. This is just the ocean, right? So blue to purple colors indicate areas of the ocean where more CO2 is diffusing into seawater than is diffusing from the seawater. So this is carbon sink, and so that's that downwelling, right? So we've got CO2 interfacing with the surface of the ocean, and it's going down. It's downwelling, and it's being stored. Green colors indicate that the movement of CO2 in and out of the ocean is fairly equal. So that's most of the mid latitudes, and right next to the Antarctic. And then yellow to red indicate areas where more CO2 is diffusing into the atmosphere than is diffusing into the water, the seawater. So it's a source, and it's interesting, right? So and that's where you're getting the upwelling. So it's really interesting to look at the spatial pattern, because you start to really notice, oh gosh, the equator plays a really important role. And it's not necessarily the Arctic waters that you would think as the sinks, although in some cases they do serve as a sink, up here. But it's these major currents, like these deep water currents, in converse to the equator. So that's the source of carbon, that's giving off carbon and back into the atmosphere. This is acting to store it. So you can imagine once water starts to warm up, what this does. So this is all different from the land. So the land is the next biggest reservoir of carbon, and it acts pretty differently. And in some ways, it's similar, but pretty differently than the ocean. I mean, you get a lot of interaction from atmospheric to land, but it's not driven by the concentration of CO2 necessarily. There's some caveat to that statement, but generally, as you add more CO2 to the atmosphere, it doesn't automatically increase the amount of carbon going through the land cycle. You have to have things like warmth and water, because it's all based on biomass. So the land contains about 40 gigatons, or 4,000, gigatons of carbon, and it's all stored in living vegetation and in soil and in permafrost. So the role of biomass on the land is much stronger than in the ocean. So on land, it's 500 to 600 gigatons of carbon are stored up in living biomass. In the ocean, it's only 3 gigatons compared to the 40,000 gigatons that's in the ocean. So on land, it's all about the living biomass, right? That's the key for the carbon cycle on land. And I mean, this varies tremendously across the Earth's surface and everything, but about 100 gigatons of carbon are removed from the atmosphere each year by photosynthesis of land plants. Some of that is re-respirated back out into the atmosphere, but we do largely think of trees as carbon sinks, right? This is why the Trillion Tree Initiative is so popular right now. Is that conceptually, hypothetically, according to things like this, our understanding of the carbon cycle, if we plant 1 trillion trees, we could capture a significant amount of carbon such that we don't, tailspin into craziness. There's some issues with that proposal, but in concept, it absolutely, has its roots in good science. We know that this carbon cycle works. We know that trees and all the biomass takes up a significant amount of carbon out of the atmosphere every single year and stores it. It's not just the trees, though. It's actually in the root structures, and more important, arguably, is the amount of soil that's in, or the amount of carbon that's in soil. So I mentioned in the living biomass on land is about 500 to 600 gigatons. We estimate soil to hold about 1,500 gigatons of carbon. So soil is absolutely huge. The microorganisms that allow soil to store the carbon are just a humongous piece of this puzzle, and this is why things like land use and everything have such an important influence. So, of course, the primary way that land interacts with carbon and in the carbon cycle is through biomass, which means photosynthesis, right? So this is the basic equation, just to remind you to back to ES 102 or whenever you learned about this, but it takes out, equal parts of carbon dioxide and water, and with the process of light turns it into carbohydrates and oxygen. So it respirates oxygen, but then it creates this sugar that when it uses that sugar to grow, it does respirate back off CO2. So it breaks down this sugar back into carbon dioxide once it gets water from something else, right? So it does respirate CO2 back off. This is that arrow right there. Of course, animals respirate it. We are constantly breathing in fresh oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. And then a bunch of other things. But yeah, this is basic fundamental thing driving the terrestrial side of the carbon cycle. And then of course you have the atmosphere that just serves as this sink, really. I mean, well, it's a source as well, but it sits up there, right? And we've got, like I said, right around 750 right now with all the human things. And so the atmosphere is primarily CO2. We kind of talked about this last week. Methane and other carbon compounds make up just a small fraction. So most of the 750 gigatons ish in the atmosphere is in the form of carbon dioxide. And even though it's considerably less than what's on the ocean or in the land, obviously carbon in the atmosphere is pretty critical because it drives a lot of those interactions in the ocean and on the land. And of course, because of the greenhouse effect that we learned about last week, we need that in order to make this a habitable land or a habitable planet. And the other key part about, it's just the fact that this is such a small piece compared to land and ocean is that it's highly vulnerable. It's more sensitive to disruptions caused by any increases in available carbon for the atmosphere. And this is why, we're so worried about carbon. Is that any perturbations really start to significantly change the relationship with the ocean and the land, and that those feedback loops that I was talking about. It's just going to feed more and more and more carbon into the atmosphere. And when you add, 200 to 750, that's significant, right? That's a lot more than adding 200 to 4,000 like you do in the land, or 200 to 40,000 in the ocean. So it's super, super sensitive, right? And so this gets into the sort of the flux then. So how do we know we're having this net increase in carbon when we understand all these sources and sinks feedback loops happening within the ocean and the land. And there's of course relationship between land and ocean working together. And this is kind of what we know, right? So we've got the global carbon cycle. We've got about this much, at least when we had 360 ppm. Now we're up to 415. But we estimate sort of the ocean takes in about 92 gigatons. It releases back off 90. So it's still acting as a net flux, you know, a reduction in in atmospheric carbon, putting it into the ocean, and that nice downwelling is putting it down there deep and storing it, right? We've got photosynthesis taking out about 100, 120 gigatons, and then plant respiration is about 50, and soil respiration is about 60. So we do have some soil respiration, right? You know, microbes breathe as well and give off the carbon dioxide. We have things like litter fall and you know, which is just anytime you lose a branch or leaves or whatever, right? All of that causes a bit of flux back up, but still you know, a net flux downward, right? So we're still all things equal, the ocean's still taking in atmospheric carbon, and so is the terrestrial, generally a 1.4 net flux. So we're storing 1.4 gigatons on the land side. However, you've got the land use piece that's putting back 1.6, so we disturb the soil. So we reduce the amount that it can photosynthesize and store, and so we contribute about 1.6 there. And then, of course, when you include things like fossil fuels burning at 6.3, we see a 7.9 gigaton increase per year. And when you do the math, even the net fluxes downward can't keep up with the net fluxes upward that we've been producing. So this is why we have an estimate of about 3.2 gigatons being added every single year, which gets us into the anthropogenic carbon cycle, right? So how much have we disrupted this natural carbon cycle, the sources versus the sinks, the net gain versus the net loss? And so reconstruction going back in time indicate that the last time we had 400 parts per million CO2 was about 3 million years ago. So we know we've done something, and that we're in a very different era. And so what this does, and I love these things, right? So anything that's going down means that it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, or it's not, you know, it's not disrupting the balance, I guess. Anything that's going up is increasing the amount of carbon available for storage. And so you have the amount that's in the atmosphere, you have the amount that would be normally stored within the land, you have the ocean, you have this gray area that represents, we know that there's more carbon being taken out than we can account for, and it's just our lack of understanding. It's you know, when we can't account for the ocean pumps or the land sinks, or what we're seeing in the atmosphere, we know there's this much carbon, you know, available, and yet it was, you know, we still can't figure out exactly where it went. It's current research, right? But then we look at sort of the things that are increasing it. So land use change, and this is over time, right? Land use change, then of course just burning that fossil carbon and liberating that into the atmosphere where it normally would not have gone. So currently humans emit about 10 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere every year, 90% from fossil fuel, about 10% from deforestation. And the ocean is pretty good about taking up about 40% of that, but yeah, 60% is staying in the atmosphere, and that's really where we're seeing these increases in the parts per million and all the measurements that we saw. We can start to break it down, since we do know something about where CO2 comes from. Like we can actually calculate the amount of CO2 burned based on fuel and that sort of thing. So you know, this one really shows mostly just the general rise in the burning of fossil fuels and those fossil carbon dioxide fuels or emissions. and really talked about, I think in the book, just that it's, you know, it's it's really really high. Since 2000, the growth has been like, oh gosh, it's about half of all the carbon put in the atmosphere by people were done in the last 30 years, I think, is what they're saying. So yeah, this represents about a half of our global contribution of carbon, that is, exceeding, exceeding the amount that we're able to store, right? There's uncertainty for every single year, and that's what this gray area is. But the slightly positive news is that it has leveled off in the last decade, primarily because that China has leveled off their emissions, and they, as a global contributor, um, they definitely are at the top of the output side. We can break down by the types because, again, we know the chemistry of coal and oil and gas, and when we combust it, we know exactly how much carbon goes out, and so that's really cool. So we know that most of our carbon emissions are due to coal most of the year. Well, recently, I guess oil was traditionally in the 60s and 70s more responsible, and even up to 2000. But yeah, coal has really kind of taken off, sadly. So it makes up about 4 gigatons. Oil is 3.4 as of a couple of years ago. Natural gas is still 2 gigatons, and then cement. And I don't know if you guys, I think I've heard some of you mentioning this before, and in some of the climatology and the news postings. But yeah, cement's it's I mean, it's not the biggest by any means, but it's significant, right? Almost half a gigaton of carbon every year, just in the production of cement. So it's in the calcification of cement that in the process of actually making it releases a ton of CO2. And then of course, the fossil fuels that it takes to go and mine it and process it, the actual heat and everything, and then distribute it, is pretty enormous as well. So it's significant. And then I'll leave you with this, right? Since we know how much is burned, we can go look at the economic side and say, well, how much coal did you process this year? How much gas did you buy or process? How much oil did you use? And then we can calculate it out by country and look at the relative contributions. And while China is the overall largest, we are still by far the largest per capita, followed by Russia, and then China, and then the EU. And then some surprising ones, right? Indonesia, and Pakistan, Nigeria. So that's the human side, right? So we've got the natural system working. We've got the human side where we're contributing more than what both the ocean and the land can kind of keep up with. Um, and so we'll get a bit more into sort of the chemistry, um, how we know the sources, or how we know how much different the carbon is that we're seeing in the deep waters and in the atmosphere, how we know that it's really the fossil fuels that are increasing those concentrations. So we'll get into the isotopes of carbon, and then a bit more about the interaction with ocean via ocean acidification.